The Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, or Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx, with some help from Friedrich Engels. Karl Marx is this 1800s German philosopher and economist. He's famous for his atheism, and he's famous for inventing communism, or at least for inventing communism in its current form, in its modern form. In ancient history, Marx himself tells us that the basics of the communist economic system were in place. Long before the current economic system emerged, he says, we had communism first. And Plato, in Book 8 of the Republic, actually has an interesting critique of a Marxist economic system, or at least an economic system with some correspondence to that of Karl Marx. So it's not necessarily that he invented communism as such, but he invented communism, or at least was the most powerful teacher of communism in the contemporary era. And he has been very influential in this. His moral and political philosophy has been extremely influential in the last 2 centuries. If you measure the greatness of a philosopher by how many people have been affected by his teachings, or by how many systems of government have been affected by his teachings, Karl Marx is certainly one of the greatest philosophers, though he does have some powerful competition from the likes of John Locke and Adam Smith. Now, Marx is influenced by Hegel. One common, fairly rudimentary way of understanding Marx, but a very good way of understanding Marx, is to describe him as a dialectical materialist. Let's talk about that. Hegel had this dialectical theory. It's a system of thinking through positions in philosophy, considering them as a thesis and an antithesis contrasted to the thesis as 2 competing positions and then synthesizing them. But it's also a philosophy of history. Hegel's philosophy of history is that we have competing interests or competing positions or competing classes or competing people, and they are synthesized. And in this synthesis, a unity and harmony is achieved, although the process keeps going. Once a synthesis is achieved, it becomes a new synthesis, and then another antithesis. Once a synthesis is achieved, it becomes a new thesis, and to it is contrasted a new antithesis, and the 2 must be synthesized, and the process repeats. The new synthesis also becomes a thesis, to be contrasted with another antithesis. But as we continue to synthesize, we gradually make things better and better, and achieve a more perfect perspective, and work towards the end of history. Well, this is Hegel's dialectic. In Marx's dialectic, we have a materialistic version. Hegel's dialectic is not materialistic. Hegel is called an idealist because he thinks ideas are real. That's a rudimentary definition of the term idealism, but it will serve nicely enough for Hegel. Well, in Hegel, to be a little more precise, we do not have materialism. We do not believe that all is matter. In Marx, we believe that all is matter. And Marx's dialectical understanding of history is a purely materialistic one. All of these theses and antitheses, all these conflicts in history have been material conflicts, economic conflicts over physical things, over money, and over economic resources. And one other salient difference between Marx and Hegel is that Marx tells us very clearly that the end of history is nigh. The final synthesis is about to happen, and that is the communist revolution. Hegel is not always clear as to whether the final synthesis will ever emerge. He certainly doesn't tell us it's about to happen, here's exactly how it's going to go down. But Marx does tell us that the final synthesis is about to go down, and it's the communist revolution. So his view that history is the story of the development of society is Hegelian in that sense. Marx and Hegel are 2 of the philosophers who have a very emphatic philosophy of history. Another influence of Hegel seems to be this passage on the master-slave relationship. This seems to have been sort of the prototype for Marx's reflections on society. Now let's talk about those reflections. Let's look at Marx's philosophy of history in just a bit more detail. There is a philosophy of history here, and it is at the root of Marx's moral philosophy. And the philosophy of history is an interesting reflection on the results of the Industrial Revolution. He tells us at the very beginning of his text, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. History is the story of the struggle of the oppressed class and the oppressing class. And what history has led to is the current situation after the Industrial Revolution has done its work. In the current situation, the perennial class struggle has crystallized. It's solidified. It's become more simple. It's now solidified into the struggle of two classes who are now clashing quite openly. And they are the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. For those who are new to Marx, proletariat is pronounced more or less like it's spelled. Proletariat. Proletariat. Bourgeoisie is originating from the French, and if you pronounced it the way it was spelled, it would be bourgeoisie. But bourgeoisie is a more appropriate pronunciation. So Marx says that there are these two classes now, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie is the middle class. Now you may think that seems strange. The proletariat now is the working class. The bourgeoisie is the middle class. Why would the middle class be clashing with the working class? Doesn't it make more sense to say that the upper class is the oppressing class and the lower class is the class that is oppressed? Well, it was once so. But after the Industrial Revolution, the upper class no longer has the real power. The power has shifted to the middle class. The power has shifted to the people we could call the capitalists. To be a little more precise, the proletariat are the people who work in the factories. And the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, which has recently risen to power, is the guys who own the factories. And some others who are part of the same class, the same factory management system. And the bourgeoisie is oppressing the proletariat. The bourgeoisie is the class that employs. They're the people who control manufacturing. They control the means of economic productivity. The proletariat are the means of economic productivity. They are the ones who do the manufacturing. They are the ones employed. They are the ones exploited by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie class developed as the result of modern economic history. And Marx gives us his account of economic history, how the medieval feudal system broke down, how various factors such as the discovery of the American continents, the rise of global trade, the various inventions that make modern mass production possible, how all of these factors shifted the means of economic productivity into the hands of the manufacturing middle class, into the hands of the bourgeoisie. And now Marx says the government itself serves the interests of the bourgeoisie class. The state is controlled by the bourgeoisie. Economic exploitation of the lower class, when you put all this together, is now open. It is shameless, direct, brutal. In previous eras, exploitation of the lower class by the controlling class had been veiled by various religious and political and cultural phenomenon. Now it is shameless, direct, and brutal, and the conflict is out in the open. And the conflict leads necessarily to the revolution. Marx thinks it is necessary that the proletariat seize power from the bourgeoisie. It is necessary morally because the exploitation needs to end. But it's also economically necessary because the broken economy of capitalism makes this revolution inevitable. And the revolution is not primarily, if at all, a violent revolution. The revolution is a revolution in economics. It's the revolution where private property is abolished. You see, the bourgeoisie control the proletariat by means of private property, by means of their ownership of the factories and everything else. Their ownership of the means of economic productivity grants them control over the proletariat, and for all practical purposes, ownership of the proletariat themselves. And this is the most complete expression of the system of economic exploitation. And private property is what makes it possible. And so the revolution in which the proletariat seized power from the bourgeoisie will be no more and no less than the abolition of private property. It's not primarily about guns and pitchforks. It's about a shift, an economic shift away from a system based on private possession and towards a system based on common ownership and common control of the means of economic productivity. So it's not necessarily a violent one. In fact, Marx tells us the first step in the revolution is to win the battle of democracy. By controlling each country through victory in democratic elections, the proletariat will gradually abolish private property. And at the end of section 4 of the Manifesto, Marx lists 10 steps that the proletariat should take in most countries. For example, there's a heavily graduated income tax, free public education, and ultimately an abolition of private land ownership. But it's these 10 steps in most locations and the democratic victory that brings about the abolition, not overnight, but somewhat gradually, the abolition of private property. And this is what the revolution is to be. It is the culmination of the history of class struggles. And after winning this battle, after seizing control of the means of production and distributing them evenly through common ownership, as a result of this private property elimination, the proletariat will actually eliminate all class distinctions and thereby cease to exist as a class. Thus Karl Marx tells us. And he says, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. And he also gives us these famous words, working men of all countries unite. And this is what Karl Marx tells us about the communist revolution.